Hi, my name is Dr. Samantha Hollins, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Special Education and Student Services here at the Virginia Department of Education. I'm going to also be joined by my colleague, Shelley Loving-Ryder, who's the Assistant Superintendent of Student Assessment and ESSA programs. Together, we're going to share some important information about the changes to the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program, known as the VAAP, that are being put in place for the 2021-22 school year. I'd like to start off with a little bit of an overview of the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program, how it's changed, and what is going to stay the same. First off, the original VAAP, or the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program, was implemented in Virginia over 20 years ago during the 2000-2001 school year as a state assessment for students with significant cognitive disabilities. Students produced various types of evidence to show what they had learned across the content areas of reading, math, science, writing, and history. Student evidence was then gathered and placed in a binder, which was referred to as a portfolio or a collection of evidence. Evidence was then based on standards that we referred to as the Aligned Standards of Learning, or the ASOL. Although we still have the VAAP, the United States Department of Education required Virginia to make some major changes. These changes are going into effect during the 2021-22 school year. Here are just a couple of the priority areas for the changes that are happening. The current VAAP portfolio or collection of evidence will be replaced by a new VAAP for reading, mathematics, and science for eligible students in grades 3 through 8 and in high school. Students can take the new test online using a computer, a tablet, or students can take the test in a paper format. The new VAAP offers a variety of testing conditions, testing supports, and accommodations to help students show what they know. There are also a couple of additional changes that are important to highlight. The next one is that the Aligned Standards of Learning, or the ASOL, will be replaced with new content standards that we refer to as the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning, or VAAP. With the help of the Virginia Department of Education staff and special education teachers from across the Commonwealth, these standards were developed. The new VAAP will be based on the VAAP, which uses standards of learning content that has been reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity to make them appropriate, relevant, and accessible for students with significant cognitive disabilities. A couple of things that have actually not changed is who decides if your student is eligible for the VAAP and how that decision is made. That eligibility has always been determined by the Individualized Education Program Team, or IEP team, and that determination has been based on the VAAP participation criteria. IEP decision-making and the use of the VAAP participation criteria will continue to be in place and used by IEP teams across the Commonwealth of Virginia. This has not changed. Now, I'd like to show you a few VAAPs so that you can see firsthand how they compare to the standards of learning, and then I'll hand it over to Shelley, who's going to share some test items and discuss how students can participate in the new VAAP. Let's look at this first example, which is from grade 3 in the area of mathematics. The standard of learning states that the student will estimate and determine the sum or difference of two whole numbers. When we look at the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning, or the VAAP, we see that this standard has been reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity, and is stated as add and subtract whole numbers up to 20. So you can see the connection between both of these standards. This next example is from grade 5 in the content area of reading. The SOL states to summarize plot events using details from text, discuss the impact of setting on plot development, describe character development, and explain the resolution of conflict. When we take this standard and reduce it in depth, breadth, and complexity, we have our Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning, or our VAAP, which states to identify a character, setting, or event in a story that's read to the student. This final example I'll share with you is actually from high school, and it's from the area of science, and biology particularly. The standard states that the student will investigate and understand that chemical and biochemical processes are essential for life. Key ideas include water chemistry has an influence on life processes, macromolecules have roles in maintaining life processes, enzymes have a role in biochemical processes, protein synthesis is the process of forming proteins, which influences inheritance and evolution, and finally, the process of photosynthesis and respiration include the capture, storage, transformation, and flow of energy. When we take this standard and we reduce it in depth, breadth, and complexity, we transition to our VAAP, which states that the student will recognize that plants need light, air, and water to grow and then create energy through photosynthesis. If you would like to see all of the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning across reading, math, and science, please visit the VAAP page on the Virginia Department of Education website. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Shelley Loving-Ryder, to talk a little bit more about the test itself and what students can expect. Thanks, Shelley.
Hello, my name is Shelley Loving-Ryder, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Student Assessment, Accountability, and ESEA programs at the Virginia Department of Education. And my department is responsible for the development and the implementation of the new VAP. We know that with the change from the old VAP, which was portfolio-based, to the new VAP, which has multiple choice items, that you probably have lots of questions about what the new VAP will be like, and also how your student will participate in the new test. The purpose of this part of the presentation is to provide you with more information about the new VAP test. We'll look at some sample items, and then we'll talk quite a bit about the supports that will be available to students participating in VAP. So let's begin with just an overview. As Dr. Hollins mentioned, the new VAP test will be administered in reading, mathematics, and science to eligible students in grades 3 through 8 in high school. Those test items will be based on the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning, and each test will include multiple choice test items with 3 answer options. Easier items are presented first, and then they're followed by more challenging items. And the purpose of this structure is really to maximize access for most students by presenting the easier items first. You may also wonder how your student will interact with the items in terms of how they will be viewed. The items can be viewed online or a computer or a device, and there's also a paper version available, and both presentations are available to all students. That can be administered individually, and we think it will likely be administered individually to most students. This will allow your student to receive the supports they need without distractions from other students. And VAP may also be administered over multiple days. We know that many students who will participate in VAP tire easily, and so we think this is an important piece of flexibility. Most of the items are read to the students. There are a small number that are not read, and we'll talk more about that a bit later in this presentation, but most of the items are read to the students either through the text-to-speech functionality available in the online presentation or through the examiner reading the test item to the students. Students can enter their responses to the items online within the online testing platform, or they can indicate their responses to the items to the examiner using their typically used communication strategy. That could be pointing, saying the answer option verbally, or using an augmentative communication device. If students are viewing the test items online, there are additional supports. We mentioned text-to-speech already. There's also color contrast and magnification. So let's look at a few sample VAP items. And the items we'll be looking at are a grade 3 mathematics item, a grade 5 reading item, and a high school science item. And you'll notice as we go through these that the structure of the items is very similar, and then the supports are provided to the students within the structure of the items. So let's look at grade 3 first. This is a math item, as I said, and the information on the left-hand side of the slide really describes the structure of the item. And then the information on the right-hand side is the actual sample test item. So let's talk about the structure of the test item first, and this will be consistent across all of the items. So it begins with really an item setup, and this is introductory information that's about the item that's either read to the student by the computer if the student is viewing the item online, or it might be read by the test examiner. And that's followed by the presentation of the test item, which here is 1 + 4 =, and then the answer options. The 3 answer options are always presented, and sometimes there are also pictures. We'll see an example of that in a moment. So let's see how this particular item works. So here's the introductory information. Again, this is red. Here is an addition problem. What is 1 plus 4? Presentation of the item, which is red. 1 plus 4 equals, and then the answer options, 1, 3, 5. Okay, let's look at the grade 5 reading item now. Again, the structure is the same. We begin with this introductory text. Here is a sentence about Ben. Then the test item, Ben likes to bake bread. What does Ben like to bake? And then the 3 answer options, apple, stove, bread. You'll notice in this example that the answer options are accompanied by pictures. And you'll notice that there's simple black and white line drawings, which is usually easiest for students to view. Then our last item, again, same structure. This is high school science. Introductory text. Here is a plant in the sun. Photosynthesis is how plants use light to make food and grow. Presentation of the item. What gives light to plants? And then the 3 answer options, leaves, sun, clouds. All right, so now that we've looked at the items and you have an idea of what the VAAP test looks like, I want to talk a bit about the supports that are available to students. There are a number of supports and flexibility that are available to all students, and these are called testing conditions. And these do not have to be documented in the IEP, but you may want to talk with your child's teacher about testing conditions that are being provided to your student. An example of these would include manipulatives like math tiles, calculators. Students can use a calculator that they typically use in the normal classroom. And then another example would be verbal and visual prompts. We know that prompts are often used to help students stay on task. There are some students who will need individual test accommodations in addition to all of the testing conditions that we are providing. And on VAAP, there are 4 testing accommodations that are available. Braille, which can be used for students who have visual impairments or blindness and who are accustomed to using Braille. Interpreting transliteration for students who are deaf and use this mode of communication. And then read aloud and alternate representation of response options. Each of these we will be talking about in more detail in subsequent slides. So let's talk about read aloud. I said earlier that the majority of the VAAP test items are read aloud to all students. And again, that's either through the test examiner reading the test question or through the text-to-speech functionality for the items that are presented online. There are a very small number of items, and they're mostly in reading, that are not read to all students. And in these items, the introductory text that's read to students will specify that they are to read all or part of the item. And it's usually the sentence that the student is to read independently, and then the answer options. If your student has a disability that impacts their ability to access text and they access content primarily by listening, then they may need the read aloud accommodation. And we would encourage you to talk with your child's teacher about that accommodation. Again, all of the accommodations must be incorporated into the IEP. So this is one that would need to be addressed within the IEP. And then the other accommodation we wanted to talk a bit more in more detail about was representation of response options. And the alternate representation of response options accommodations allows for the 3 answer options to be represented in a different way. And so examples may be that the answer choices are made into choice cards. Another example would be using physical objects for the answer choices like real money or a clock. And then the last example is picture-based communication systems used for the answer choices. And we know this is a system that's used for many students, and PECS would be an example of a picture-based communication system. Again, all accommodations must be documented in the child's IEP. So if this is an accommodation that your student will need, it will need to be documented in the IEP. All right, we've talked now about what the VAAP test looks like. We've looked at some items. We've talked about the supports that are available to all students and the flexibilities, and also the accommodations that can be available to students if they're documented in their IEP. And now I want to talk a bit about what happens if despite the flexibilities, a student struggles to complete the test. The VAAP tests do have 35 test items, and the flexibility to administer VAAP in multiple test sessions, and also the organization of the items from easy to more challenging. Those flexibilities are really intended to support students in completing the test. However, we do know that there will be some students who may not be able to complete all of the test items despite these flexibilities. And so if this does occur and the examiner determines that the student really can go no further, and that it is in their best interest to stop testing, then testing can be discontinued. Students who've completed at least 5 items will be considered participants, and this really is for federal accountability purposes, but testing can be discontinued at any point in the test. And you should be aware that discontinuing testing will impact the student's score. So the VAAP test will be administered for the first time this spring, and you may be wondering how you can help prepare your student for the first test administration. The testing will be this spring, and the window opens February the 28th and goes till June the 24th. And within that window, your child's school division will identify a VAAP testing window. In terms of helping your student to be prepared, your student's teacher is currently teaching content based on the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning. In addition, there are also practice items and examiner's copies that are available on our website. And these practice items are presented both in the online format in TestNav and also in the paper format. The examiner's copy referenced here provides the text that the examiner reads to the student. So that's why it's also included with the practice items. They are available for each of the grade levels and the content areas for the new VAAP. In addition to the practice items, there are also some sample items. There are 10 of these, and they are available to really give a quick snapshot of what the new VAAP items look like. And those 10 sample items are based on various content areas and grade levels. And all of this information is available on the department's website. And so let's talk now about how you access that. So the easiest way to get to this information is to go to the DOE website. That's doe.virginia.gov. That will take you to our homepage. And on the right-hand side of the homepage, you'll see a bar that says, "How do I find?" And near the bottom of that list, you'll see VAAP. If you click on that VAAP link, it will take you to a wealth of resources. There's information there about the Virginia Essentialized Standards of Learning. The practice items that we talked about are there, the sample items. There are frequently asked questions, and then various other webinars and modules that have been provided to school division personnel. So we hope that you will take advantage of the resources that are provided here to learn more about that. Once VAP is administered this spring, you will get a score report for your student sometime this summer in the early fall. The score reports are going to be available a bit later than normal this year because this is a new test. And specific dates as far as when the reports will be provided will be determined by your student's school division. Please do keep in mind that your student's score on VAP does not impact their promotion to the next grade or their graduation from high school with an applied studies diploma. Really, the intent of VAP is to provide information about what the student has learned during the school year. So let's just summarize what we've talked about and review what's different with the old VAP and the new. The old VAP was based on student work samples that were compiled into a portfolio called a collection of evidence. And the old VAP really was administered across the school year as those work samples were collected. The new VAP is going to be administered in reading, mathematics, and science, and each of those tests are composed of test questions with 3 answer choices. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the test questions will be ordered with the easiest ones in the beginning of the test, and then those will be followed by more challenging questions. The new VAP will be administered this spring. For most students, it will be administered individually, and as we talked earlier, there are a variety of testing conditions available to all students. Those do not have to be documented in the IEP. There are also 4 accommodations that may be needed by a small number of students, and those accommodations must be documented in the IEP. If you do have questions, you can certainly reach out to your student's school or school division, but here's contact information for department staff if you have questions for us. If you have questions about your child's eligibility to participate in the new VAP, please contact Deborah Johnson, and her email address is there. If you have questions about the new VAP test, please contact the student assessment staff. Our phone number is there, and we also have an email there. And in closing, I just wanted to thank you for the partnership in your students' education. We know that you play a very important part in their lives, and we appreciate the support and advocacy you provide to them each day. Again, we thank you for listening to this video, and if you do have questions, please do reach out to us. Thank you again.